Welcome to the Law School Insider, where we have conversations with students, lawyers, and employers.
Succeeding in law school is something that you must prepare for, not only before you begin, but throughout your law school journey, and that's what this podcast is all about. I am your host, Dr. Christopher Lewis, and I will draw from my over 20 years of experience in the college admission field, as well as bring forth the experiences of others as we delve deeper into the issues. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Law School Insider. I'm your host, Dr. Christopher Lewis, and I'm so excited to be able to have you back again this week. This week, I am really proud to be able to bring you a professor of law at Western Michigan University, Cooley Law School, Linda Kisabeth, who is going to be joining us to talk to us about something different that we've not talked about in the past. We're going to be talking about outlines, and you may have already been hearing about how important it is to be able to build good outlines as you go through law school. But we've not really talked about some of the nitty-gritty and some of the things that you might even be able to do right now as you're preparing for law school or as you're getting into law school for the first time to be able to set yourself up well to find success when you're in your classes and making those outlines to be able to be prepared for your eventual exams and really to be able to take in the content of the class that you're going to be taking. So, Professor Kisabeth, thanks so much for joining us this week.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I am just excited to be able to have you here because I know that you work with students on a daily basis trying to help them not only in your class, but also beyond that to teach them about ways in which they can find success in your class. And part of that is when we're talking about capturing the information that is being shared with them in the course. In law school, that is primarily through building an outline that's going to help them to prepare for that final exam. So in the conversations that you have with students, are there certain things that you start off with, and maybe we should step back too and explain the difference between an outline that they might be thinking about from undergrad and what an outline is in law school?
I think an outline in undergrad can take a variety of different forms depending on the course that the student is taking, the content within the course, the subject matter, a whole variety of things, and the whole approach to how they study. Law school is a completely different animal than anything in undergrad. The volume and the content of the material are unlike what most students would have encountered in undergrad. It is, after all, a doctorate program. It's a graduate school level program. And the area of law in particular, many students find very challenging, as it should be. It is one of the more difficult doctorate degrees to obtain. So in the very beginning, I tell them to be successful, you have to be able to assimilate and cohesively put together in some logical order a vast amount of very difficult information and see it from the bigger picture and be able to see how concepts relate and overlap to one another. Whether or not students do that in undergrad, I couldn't speak to that. I can only speak to the way the information is recommended to be arranged in an outline in law school.
Well, I think that's really important. So let's talk a little bit about that. And when you talk about the law school outline, and that things should be in a specific order, are there best practices? Are there things that you have found that successful students do to be able to build a good outline? And are there things that people can do right now to start to get their mind in that place for when they do start classes?
Yes, one of the things I tell the students is at the beginning of the semester, even before you start the class, look at the class syllabus. Because generally the class syllabus is broken down into large sections of material that the professor will be covering and that the students will be reviewing in their textbook. And many times those sections that are paired off or sectioned off in the syllabus coexist with the table of contents with the textbook. So a student could look at the syllabus and see the chunks of material that are going to be required for them to know for the entire class, see where those sections are within the table of contents of their textbook, and start to create what I call a skeletal, large-scale outline of the larger topics. For example, in Contracts 1, there are 5 big topics that we will cover over the 14 to 15-week course of the term. We cover, and those 5 big topics are offer, acceptance, consideration, damages and remedies, and last of all, statute of frauds. And so if a student could start, even before they start class, understand that those are the 5 large, big categories of information they're going to need to know those would be large scale headings for an overall outline. And I always tell the students the best outlines have very small amounts of large scale outlining, meaning you should not have more than probably 8 to 10 large scale topics that you're going to learn in any given course. So the smaller you keep that number, the better off you're going to be, because a student can remember 8 to 10 large concepts. And I also liken it, the large scale organization to almost like a lateral file cabinet. So if you had a large volume of information, which is exactly what an outline is, you have large volumes of information that you have to put in a certain order and be able to remember it, retrieve it, recall it, regurgitate it, and apply it when needed on a final exam. So the best way to outline it, the way I look at it from the large scale, again, in the beginning, if you liken it to a file cabinet, if I had those 5 large topics that I knew I was going to learn in contracts 1, I would take those 5 large topics and say, if I had to put those all in a 5-drawer filing cabinet, what would I label each drawer? So, for example, drawer 1 would be offer, all the rules, because there's multiple rules regarding an offer. But my first drawer is going to be labeled offer. My second drawer would be labeled acceptance, because there is a ton of rules regarding acceptance. My third drawer would be labeled consideration, because there's a ton of rules regarding consideration, because you need offer, acceptance, and consideration to have a valid and binding contract. The fourth drawer in that filing cabinet, which is, again, our large-scale organization when you're looking at the class big picture, that fourth drawer would be labeled damages/remedies. Because, again, you would learn lots of rules regarding that large topic. Then the fifth drawer would obviously be labeled statute of frauds. And, again, lots of rules for that. Okay, so you have your large-scale organization. That's seeing the entire class over 14 weeks in the big picture and seeing what those large chunks of information are. That's first and foremost. Then the next step would be to do your small-scale organization. So in that first lateral file drawer that we labeled offer, once you go through the lectures, go through the reading material, go through any additional things that the professor gives you regarding that large topic, figure out how many rules are going to fit into, or folders that are going to fit into that filing cabinet. That's your small scale organization, and associate a number with it. And that's up to the student to come up with however many number of rules that they've learned or they've been taught. So if they can associate, you already know you have 5 large topics on the large scale organization. Now figure out how many folders or rules are within each one of those large topics and associate a number with that. Because I always tell students their brains are usually work compartmentalizing, and that's a good way to view it. You can compartmentalize this information, and that's the best way to organize it. So if you figure out how many rules or how many folders are in that first drawer, then go to the next drawer. How many rules, how many folders are in that second drawer, and associate a number. I'm just throwing numbers out there. Let's say the first drawer offer has 10 folders in it. The second drawer has 15 folders in it because there's 15 associated rules. The third drawer has 20 in it. The fourth drawer has, 8 in it. And so on and so on. And so if a student can remember, okay, I've got 5 large topics. Now within those 5 large topics, which folder or which rule am I going to pull out of that large topic to apply to this new fact pattern that I'm going to have on a final exam? So the final exam also challenges them to issue spot, but having a good organized outline in both the large scale and the small scale, at least that gives the student a starting point of where they should look. Because what ends up happening is most students will look at an essay question after having spent 14 weeks in a class and learned volumes of rules, and they don't have the first or slightest sort of idea where to begin. And I always tell them, well, which large topic is at issue here? Which file drawer would you open? If the issue in this fact pattern is regarding acceptance, then open the acceptance drawer and decide which folder you're pulling out, which is the small scale organization, the individual rule regarding acceptance that you would apply to this particular fact pattern. And then you regurgitate the rule and apply it to the fact pattern. So the large scale organization, I always tell them again, keep that number low. You don't want the large scale organization to be too overwhelming. But the small scale organization, that can have a larger number associated with it. But in any numbering system beyond that, I have found and I have seen student outlines, if they're too long or they're too detailed in their methodology of how they label them, they tend to get lost in the forest because of the trees. There's no organizational structure to the outline. They just have pages and pages and pages of rules with no organization to them. So the strongest thing that I tell them is figure out your large scale organization based on the content of the course from the syllabus and sort of pair that up with the table of contents from the book. Then once you go through the material that the professor has instructed that you read, you go through the class lectures, you go through briefing the cases, whatever's assigned to you, that's when you start to develop the small scale organization and how many rules will fit under each one of those large topics. In that description, I hope I didn't spend too long talking about it. I hope that gives you a sense of sort of where I'm at, big picture and small picture as it relates to outline.
No, that really helps. And I think that all of you that are listening can think about this as you are looking at law and looking at the topics that you're going to be covering. And I think this is a great way to conceptualize this. And you might even be able to think, if you currently are taking classes or if you've taken classes in the past, you might be able to look at an old syllabus and be able to look and see, how would I have done it if I had done it differently, or if I was to think about the course in that way too, because it is a different way of thinking and a different way of processing information. And as you gain more information, you're filing it away in that file cabinet that Professor Kisabeth was mentioning. So when you are working with students and the students are building this outline for themselves, you've seen them through the term into the final exam period, or, they're working through the time in your course. Are you finding that there are any pitfalls? Is there anything that students have had a challenge with when it comes to their outline that someone, if they knew beforehand, could mitigate and could try to fend off if they were able to ahead of time?
Some of the biggest pitfalls I tend to see that students tend to correct after the fact, which is unfortunate because they really should try to, as you indicate, correct it ahead of time. A couple things. Well, the organization is number one. I've seen a lot of student outlines that don't have what I think is a cohesive organizational process that goes along with it. I've also seen outlines that are just not detailed enough. They're too short. They don't have enough information. They don't encompass all the information that the student's responsible for that particular course. So again, that comes back to making sure, they take good notes, understanding what material will be covered in that class, and making sure that they have all the detailed information in the outline. The other side of that same sort of extreme is I've seen outlines that are way too long. I've seen 100-page outlines for a 14-week course that has too much information in there. For example, a student might literally put in every single case that they would have talked about each week regarding a particular subject. And while case law is important to have in your outline, sometimes there can be too much. And if you have a 100-page outline, I tell students that's not something you can memorize. You can learn from creating an under 100-page outline, but that's not something you can memorize. Most people can't memorize 100 pages. I suppose there may be one or two people, but the average student couldn't. So I always tell them, be careful. Don't have your outline too detailed and too long where it's unmanageable. And again, if there's no organization to it, they wouldn't even know where to go in the outline to find the rule that they need if it's too long and too verbose and too detailed. So somewhere in the middle is the optimal goal, I think, for an outline. And there is no set page number. I get that question all the time too from students. What is, the optimal page number? There is no optimal page number. It depends on the course. It depends on how much content and material is composed in the course. It depends on, how many examples you want to put regarding the rules in your outline to help you truly understand it. The other part of that, too, I will say that might help students that I encourage them to do is if they tend to create a really good outline that is detailed, but not 100 pages, the act of creating it itself helps solidify the information in their mind, because reading somebody else's outline or reading a commercial outline, that's not going to help them because they're not going to retain that information in their brain. It's the act of creating it themselves and organizing it themselves that helps ensure the retention in their brain. But what I also tell them too, so if you have a larger outline, there's nothing really wrong with that, but that's not something that you're going to use at the very end right before the final exam to study from. So sometimes I tell students you can have an outline that you're learning from. You learn the material as you're creating an outline, but then right before you get to the final exam, you might want to pare that down and make it no less than something like 15 pages, 10 to 15 pages. And we tend to call that an attack outline, where you extract all the examples and the miscellaneous things that you added to the original outline that helped you learn the material, and you just have the skeletal rules and nothing else. And that's the piece that they could, use to memorize and attack the question right at the very end, right before they take the final exam. But the attack outline all by itself should not be substituted for the full outline, because the full outline is really how they learn the material, see how all the pieces interact with one another. Because as I said, if you've got 5 large topics, how are those all interrelated, and how do they work together in applying it to a new fact pattern and studying law? And so they can't always do that with a larger outline. They have to be able to see it from the bigger picture and just the skeletal piece right towards the very end. So I guess to go back to your original question, is some of the pitfalls that they can stay away from: don't have an outline that's too long, but also don't have one that's too short. There's somewhere in the middle that's got to be what I would call the sweet spot. And that's up for the student to decide what that is, with perhaps some guidance or help from either the professor or an academic resource specialist.
Now, I want to delve a little bit into the professor relationship, the academic resource relationship, because some students might be a little bit hesitant to bring their outline in front of those people to say, am I doing this right? Is this the right way to go? What is your take on that? And what do you say to students about approaching you? And what's kind of the right approach, would you say, for a faculty member to be able to talk about your outline to make sure you're on that right track?
Well, in my experience, all the professors have somewhat an individual approach to outlines and whether they'll meet with students regarding outlines. I do advise students about outlines and how to create them. However, I personally don't meet individually and go over a student's outline. And the way it's sort of structured is our academic resource professionals take more time doing that. I give them tips on how to structure it specifically for my class, because I talk to them about the large scale and small scale organization. But if a student wants to meet specifically about my course and the outline they'd create for my course, I would direct them usually to the academic resource professionals or to my teaching assistant. I always have a teaching assistant who is an active student at that point, who's either gotten an A or the Blue Book Award in my course. And I think that's just a more effective way. A student feels more comfortable going to those people versus the individual professor. And that's not always the best use of the professor's time. I always tell the students, come to me if you have problems with the substantive material and you're not clear about that, and we'll work our way through it. But the actual process of creating the outline, I'll give you the big picture of the large scale and the small scale organization, and then you go off on your own and do it. And if you need assistance, then seek out and again, this is for me, all professors could be somewhat different. I then direct them to the academic resource professionals or my teaching assistant, because they are better equipped, and that's a better use of their time to make sure the student is creating an outline that is going to be more useful to that individual student for my particular course. But again, each professor could have a different approach as to how they interact with students regarding outlines.
I appreciate you sharing that. Now, are there any other hints, tips, resources, things that people could try now or read now that might open their eyes a little bit to what a law school outline might look like, or what they could be maybe even attempting to try even before they get into a law school class that you might recommend to them?
Well, there's a lot of commercial resources out there of outlines. There are commercially prepared outlines for most law school classes. And while they're not bad, as I indicated before, it's not in the student's best interest to use that to study from. They really should be creating their own, but it is a resource that they could go to, perhaps even prior to law school, to seeing the content from the big picture of a particular course. For example, again, I use contracts because I teach contracts. You can get commercialized, medium, large, small outlines of an entire contract course, and it wouldn't hurt to take a look at those commercial outlines. But I would be aware that once a student starts law school, they shouldn't rely on that commercial outline. They could use it as a resource to sort of double check their own creation of their own outline and double check it against the commercial outline. But I always warn students, if you're going to do that, and I don't discourage it, I just warn them, if you're going to do that, be aware that the commercial outlines, depending on who has prepared those, they may not always present the material or the rules in the exact same way that their individual professor may present them. So, for example, in my class, I teach certain sections from the Uniform Commercial Code when you're dealing with contracts for the sale of goods. And certain sections of the Uniform Commercial Code are applicable in certain circumstances, and sometimes they're not. And the way different states approach those rules are somewhat different. So you could get a commercial outline that has a rule about the Uniform Commercial Code that might not be exactly the way that your professor teaches it or presents it. And so I always tell them, be careful if you're, creating your outline and looking at a commercial outline just to make sure you're sort of on the right track and you got the right structure going on. Just be careful. If there's a discrepancy between the commercial outline and the outline the student is creating or a prospective student is creating on their own, always go with what your professor has said, because the professor is going to be creating the final exam that they would have to take. But that is a resource that somebody who's either in law school or contemplating law school could look at to see what a structured outline looks like. There are commercial resources out there, but again, I don't recommend it for a student who's actually starting law school. They need to create their own. It's the process of creating it that helps cement the information in their brain and helps them learn it. But they can always use the commercial resource as sort of a secondary guide to check their outline against to make sure that they have the right structure and they have all the requisite content and detail, again, that's consistent with the way their professor teaches.
Well, I truly appreciate you sharing this and all the information today. And I am hoping that we can have you back again soon to share more valuable information with all of our listeners in the future.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that was another great guest this week on the Law School Insider. If you have an interest in being a guest on the show, drop me an email at lawschoolinsider@cooley, COOLEY.edu. And thank you all for listening today. And remember, you have the ability and right to take control of your law school's success. I hope you'll continue listening, creating a plan for success that will prepare you to achieve the dreams that you have set for yourself. Talk to you next time. Thanks for listening. You're on your way to being a law school insider. Please subscribe to stay connected and come back again next time as we speak to more students, lawyers, and employers.